Well, hello, Jennifer Eason here, and I want to thank you for subscribing to my channel. I've had a lot of new people subscribe since the live stream with Jason Brashears, which was amazing. I am still just downloading so many treasures from that live stream. So I want to say welcome, thank you, and I hope you enjoy the content here. And taking a page out of Jason's book, I thought that I would introduce myself in a brief way via this video. I come from a rather interesting union between two Philadelphians. My mother and father met in West Philadelphia. They are probably two of the most unlikely people that I would have ever thought would have gotten together, and it is quite a mystery. And judging from the pictures do tell stories. And my mother recently told me that she had what they called cold feet and did not want to go forward in this marriage. So on her wedding day, she told her parents that she didn't want to get married to my father. And her parents reminded her of all the money that they have already paid for her wedding. So she went forward with the wedding. I don't think it's a good idea to do that, parents. Just a note. On a mudflood note, however, they got married at a Catholic church in West Philadelphia. My father being Catholic, my mother was Baptist. And the Catholic church is no longer standing. It was one of those amazing structures that we tend to look at while we go on these journeys of mudflood, Tartaria. So I found that interesting that the church is no longer standing. I gathered some pictures a while back of the church and the architecture. It was amazing. It had one of those amazing pipe organs and just the interior. Like people go around and take pictures of places like that. So it had already been neglected and abandoned, and people had taken pictures of the interior. It was pretty eerie, but yet beautiful in a strange way, if you know what I mean. But I just found it interesting that I asked my mother one day the name of the church and went on a search and found out that interesting history. And another couple that was very unlikely to come together would be my grandmother and grandfather, my mother's parents. My grandmother was from a family that favored her sister over her, and they wanted her sister to marry my grandfather because he was just a very great guy, great catch, as they say. But he liked my grandmother, so that was interesting because her whole family was conspiring. With lots of mystery and intrigue that goes on in families, I could do so many videos about such. One of the things about my grandfather is that he was what I suspect one of the orphans from that orphan train era. He fits in to that time period. We know nothing about where he came from. It's a very long story, and I may get into it one day, but I'm just going to say that I intuitively believe that he is one of those orphans. My mother and her siblings, they grew up in West Philadelphia, and it was a really nice middle class life. And she did good things like traveled down south to visit family, and her father, my grandfather, had cool entrepreneurial side hustles, like he was a photographer, and my mom and my uncle and aunt would go and help him. He did like family portraits and things like that. He owned a soda shop in West Philadelphia, and he had a grocery store as well as he worked for RCA. He fixed televisions on the side, so he did a lot of side hustles, which helped them to live a nice life. And my mother, went on her proms. As you can see, she was just a nice girl. And I have to make a side note that when my mother married in that era, she was a virgin when she got married, which shows a lot of differences in the times. I was born in Gary, Indiana, because my father was a chemist in the steel industry and moved to the Chicago area after college and after marrying my mother. And they moved to a suburb of Chicago at the time, Gary, Indiana. That was where his main laboratory was. So I was born in Gary, Indiana. I have learned a lot about Gary, Indiana, that it was basically like one of those Amazon towns, that the steel industry created a lot of cities. And when I go back to look into the history of Gary, Indiana, it's just very strange. But once the steel industry died in America, so the cities that were connected to the steel industry. Well, surprise, surprise, my parents ended up getting a divorce, which was different for the times. And my mother ended up moving from Gary, Indiana, back to West Philadelphia, where she and I lived with her parents, my grandparents. Making the very long story short, this didn't go over very well with my father, so a lot of drama ensued. My dad and I ended up in Havana, Cuba, living for a couple of years. Yeah, real interesting. Got some crazy stories to tell, but I won't do it here. But I'll just say this. He played basketball with Fidel Castro. He helped with a lot of great agriculture, like coffee and what else? Let's see. Oh, tobacco, probably. I'm just probably making up other crops, but, just helping out with the Academy of Sciences, cool stuff like that. Real pretty girlfriend named Carrie, helped take care of me. Wonderful family. I had Russian and German caretakers, hence why people have accused me of being some kind of Russian agent. I get it. Yeah, weird stuff. I was treated like royalty in Havana. I loved the school that I lived at. Yes, I lived at my school. I went to a school for communist officials would send their kids there, but I lived at the school. Yeah, while my dad was at work, and I would come to stay with his girlfriend Carrie at times, and sometimes, yeah, we had a little place, in Havana, and so yeah, it was a mix of all of that and above. I have memories sometimes of the school and just, how it was set up, how we had little shower area, we had bunk beds and stuff like that. So I get little flashbacks about that. One of the more odd flashbacks that I get is remembering when Fidel Castro would come by the school. He would pay a visit and we would all have to sing songs to him. And I just remember how I felt in his presence. He was a very tall and just powerful. You could feel the power coming off of him. And I was a little scared of him, but then I wasn't. The one person that went through probably the most in this situation is my mother. And my mother is my favorite human on this earth realm. And I am very close with her. And her love language is food and shopping. But she is one of the strongest people that I know. Seriously, trust me. After a very long odyssey that ended with a very long cruise, sailing from Havana to Africa to Montreal, Canada. And I ended up in a foster home in Plattsburgh, New York, where my grandfather and mother had to come and get me. Long story, but just interesting little side note. I've heard from many people who tell me I should write a book. I guess it might be an interesting book, I don't know. I even promised my grandmother that I would write a book about this experience, this odyssey, and kind of feel bad that I haven't kept my word. But yeah, Cuba has a really interesting place in my life. One thing I know is what communism is like to live under. I have seen it firsthand. Although I've dreamed of being defiant, and rebellious, I colored within the lines mostly. My rebellion mainly came in ways of just being an oddball. But I did what was expected in many ways. I went to college and collected so much student loan debt and all of that stuff. And I became a nurse after being a model, running away from college. I dropped out in the middle and ran off to Europe and did some modeling. What an absolute nightmare. At 19, I moved to Milan, Italy, where I modeled for 1 year. And I have to say, that experience in terms of living in Italy was wonderful. And I had some bad experiences, but my bad experiences were mainly because of the modeling industry and the darkness that is involved. I stayed away from a lot of it, but that made for a lonely existence in another country that was not my home. I eventually met some really wonderful people once I got plugged in, and I had 3 people who looked out for me like angels. And I even had I can't even count how many cats one day looked out for me. That's another story I'll have to tell you all. It's an unbelievable story. When I returned back to the United States, I was super serious about finishing my education, and I got a baccalaureate in nursing from Temple University in Philadelphia, where I have worked basically in healthcare, although I did take some time, maybe 10 years, to work in big pharma. But it's been over 33 years that I have been in healthcare. I worked on the front lines of the flim-flam-demic and even went to New York City and was treated like a hero all of 2020, only to be treated like a zero, as I've said. So my career in nursing is officially over. Interestingly, prior to 2020, I had attempted to mitigate some of the nursing stress and things that go along with it, and I had obtained a degree in barbering. So I became a barber, and it was quite interesting. I learned a lot from some really great guys. And I did that for a period of time. I have not currently been doing it, but one of the things I had enjoyed so much from barbering is the luxury services. I've talked about this before, the straight edge shaves with the hot lather and the towels and the whole, just the ritual of it I love. And also knowing that the blade on the shaver is the sharpest, it's sharper than a scalpel's tool. So I like that, because nurses, we kind of think we are doctors and surgeons. I also see it as something that women might like a little more than other aspects of barbering. Barbering is an interesting space when women enter it. I will talk more about that at another time. I learned a lot about gender and issues around gender. I've been really paying attention to these conversations. So I do have some insights on how women move in that profession. My conversation with Jason Brashears was so inspiring. I want to look into the vapor canopy more and the matriarchal civilizations, the aspect of the moon, which I really want to understand more about. But I did grow up in a family that was, I would say, a hybrid of a matriarch and a patriarchy. My grandmother was the one that she ran the family in a lot of ways, and she was a very strong matriarch. She had become ill later in her life, like midway in her life. She was actually injured by a jab. So she lived the rest of her life from her 30s on till she died in her 60s. But she was very ill from the jab that she had received the injury from. So she ran the family even in her illness, from a bed, sometimes from a hospital bed she ran the family, or from a wheelchair she ran the family with an iron fist. But at the same time, she taught me so much. And she was a very fair person, even though she was one you never wanted to just like drop out of her favor. So we were all vying to always stay in her good graces. And that was interesting. You can imagine the family dynamic. But she was very loving at the same time, very nurturing. And she was someone who, I would say, taught us all how to prepare a table. And I would say that I'm interested in the aspect of preparing a table like for humanity and being a part of nurturing and healing all of the trauma that has happened in this false construct. So I will be looking into issues of the vapor canopy and the matriarchal aspect of the pre-flood world. So I'll gather information. If you have sources, I'll be spending a lot of time on Jason's website. And if you have any good sources, I would love for you to share them. And just finishing up where I left off with my little story. I have been married, divorced, I have a daughter, and I basically now in my retirement, you would say from my profession, forced retirement, I'm looking at how to develop ways to sustain outside of that controlled system as much as possible. So that is my ultimate goal, is to move away and just to be absorbed in a more organic, harmonious, sustainable lifestyle. So I'll talk more about it in coming days. I look forward to having another live stream, especially with all the new people. I want us all to welcome new people. I know you did. I didn't get a chance to look at the chat so much because I was so focused on what Jason was saying. But thank you for the support, and again for the like, subscribe, and share. I appreciate it all. I love you, and I will see you soon. God bless you.